glad you're here. If you have your Bible, go to 2 Corinthians chapter 5. Just want to let you know, too, as you leave today, there will be some guys in the lobby that have offering plates in case you feel led to give to the Gideons. They'll take check, cash, jewelry, whatever you need, however you want to give. Also, if you don't have any of that with you, you can use the dip jar over at Connection Point, and we'll be glad to help you figure that out. Now, a couple years ago, there was an article in the New Yorker that got a lot of media attention, and I took a picture of it. The headline said this, Silicon Valley's quest to live forever. In the article, it gave a behind-the-scenes look at this ultra-secret group of wealthy investors and leaders from various industries who have joined together to, in their own words, eliminate death. The group includes venture capitalists, Hollywood celebrities, biochemists, futurists, Russian billionaires, Nobel Prize-winning geneticists, hedge fund directors, and several CEOs from some of the leading tech companies. One of the names that you might recognize is a guy named Sergey Brin, who is the co-founder of Google. In the article, he made this statement to the reporter. He said, "To be clear, I'm not actually planning to die. Clearly, it is possible through technology to make death optional." That was his quote. Now, according to the best research, the human body at maximum life capacity could live to be somewhere around 115 years. After that, even the most healthy body begins to break down and can no longer sustain life. But this group has got together in hopes of pushing that number up closer to 200 and then on to 1,000 in the coming decades. Another name you might recognize is the name Peter Thiel. He and a guy named Larry Ellison have invested billions of dollars of their own money into funding research into how to make that happen, how to expand life expectancy. Even Google itself has started another company called Calico that's focused exclusively on reversing the effects of aging on the human body. Peter Thiel said it like this. He said, "The great unfinished task of the modern world is to turn death from a fact of life into a problem to be solved." And then he added this, "and we intend to solve it." Now, it's interesting. If you go back in history, what the New Yorker makes sound so cutting edge is really nothing new. It's an idea that's been around since the very beginning of time. The idea that human beings could somehow figure out a way to prolong life and eliminate death has been a constant theme. All of us have read stories of some adventurer, that set out and searched for the fountain of youth. We've all read stories of kings who sold their souls in order to become immortal. Even the legendary baseball player Ted Williams had his body frozen in hopes that in the future they'll be able to figure out a way to bring him back to life. Now, I read an article this week where his head is in Arizona and his body is in New York City. So I'm not sure how that's all going to work out for him, but that's the plan. The truth is that none of us enjoy talking about death unless we're talking about how to avoid it. And yet, it's something that sooner or later confronts all of us. So I thought after our celebration of Easter, it might be helpful if we take a few weeks and look at what comes next. What happens when this life comes to an end and you enter into the next life? Assuming that attempts to eliminate death continue to be unsuccessful, it's something that all of us are eventually going to face. I looked it up this week. According to the latest research, somewhere around 151,600 people die every single day worldwide. If you break it down further, that equals 6,136 people who die every single hour. And yet, much of what we think we know about death and about what comes next is a mixture of misinformation and confusion. Some people believe you're trapped in this cycle of reincarnation. So one life comes to an end and immediately you come back as something else or as someone else. Some people believe you simply go to sleep and that's kind of the end of it. You cease to exist. And then you hear all the stories about purgatory and hell and heaven, and it get kind of confusing. Then you turn on the television or you go to a bookstore and you see story after story of people who've had near-death experiences, and all of them come back saying something different. Somebody says, "I saw a bright light at the end of a tunnel." Somebody else says, "I saw my mom and dad standing near the river." Somebody else says, "I saw this huge pit and it felt like I was falling." And they seem to contradict each other. And then you try to put all that together, and it gets kind of confusing. So how do you make sense of all that? That's what we're going to try to do over the next few weeks. And 2 Corinthians chapter 5 is a great place to start. When you look at the Bible, I want to be clear with you, there are some things that we do know about what comes next. But there's also an element of mystery to a lot of this. There's just some things that we really aren't sure about. In 2 Corinthians 12, you don't need to turn there, but the Apostle Paul talks about this experience he had in which he was given a glimpse of what comes next. But rather than coming back and giving us a detailed description of everything he experienced, I want you to look at what he says in 2 Corinthians 12. He says, I was caught up in paradise, and I heard inexpressible things that no one is permitted to tell. So Paul made it clear there were some things he saw, there were some things that he experienced when he got this glimpse of what comes next that he couldn't talk about. He was not permitted to describe them. You might think about it like this. I want you to imagine that you and your family took a tour of London and you went to Buckingham Palace where the Queen of England resides. And for some reason, as part of your tour, you were able to get out of the main areas and you were given sort of the behind-the-scenes look at Buckingham Palace. You went into the Queen's private residence, you ate a meal in her private dining room, you saw sort of the secret hallways and the private offices. At some point in the tour, they even took you down into the basement where they keep all the jewels and the priceless works of art. And you got to see stuff that nobody else ever gets to see. The only stipulation for your tour, though, is that you weren't allowed to take any pictures. You could look at anything you wanted, you could open any door, you could look behind any curtain, but you were not allowed to take any pictures. So you return back from your trip, your local school hears about it, they invite you to come in and explain what you experienced to a kindergarten class. Now, immediately, you realize, hey, there's some things you can probably explain. I mean, you can probably show them a picture of Buckingham Palace. You can explain who lives there and what goes on there. But for the most part, you know that it's not going to be possible to explain to this kindergarten class everything that you experience because they don't have the mental categories to process everything that you experienced. I think it's the same way when Paul comes back from heaven and he's trying to explain to us some of the things he saw. We just don't have the categories to really make sense of all of them. So I want you to know, whenever you talk about what comes next, there are some things we can understand, but there are a lot of things that we don't yet understand. In another place, Paul describes it like he says, you're looking through this window, this glass that's all fogged up. And there's some, you can see some big things through the fog, but you can't make out many of the details because you can't see clearly. So there's some things we won't know until we experience them in the future. So over the next few weeks, I want you to be aware, we'll answer some of your questions, but probably not all your questions. 2 Corinthians 5, Paul is writing to some people who are asking some questions about what comes next. The way it reads, there are some of the people in this church at Corinth who have become so anxious over dying that they're now trying to prolong their lives until Jesus comes back. They're convinced that if they can just figure out a way to stay alive until Jesus returns, then they won't have to worry about any of this. And word of that somehow gets back to Paul. So he writes this letter to answer their questions. But keep in mind, at this point in his life, Paul's also getting a little bit older, and he knows that he's getting closer to the finish line himself. With that in mind, I want you to look at what he writes. 2 Corinthians 5, verse 1. For we know that if the earthly tent we live in is destroyed, we have a building from God, an eternal house in heaven, not built by human hands. Meanwhile, we groan, longing to be clothed instead with our heavenly dwelling, because when we are clothed, we will not be found naked. For while we are in this tent, we groan and are burdened, because we do not wish to be unclothed, but to be clothed instead with our heavenly dwelling, so that what is mortal may be swallowed up by life. Now the one who has fashioned us for this very purpose is God, who's given us the Spirit as a deposit, guaranteeing what is to come. Now this is a passage, you sometimes hear this read at funerals, but you rarely hear it explained. And the reason you'll hear it explained very often is because it can be kind of confusing if you don't pay careful attention. But in these first 5 verses, Paul is painting us a picture of what life on earth looks like and feels like. And one of the things you may not realize, Paul was a guy, started churches, traveled the world, recruited leaders, trained leaders, but in order to make a living, he served as a tent maker. He was a guy that took leather and made these huge, elaborate tents. So because of that, when he comes to this, it's only natural that he would use that as an illustration of what life on earth is like. It's like living in a tent. Now, I don't know if you're a person that likes to camp or not, but if you are, you can go online today, you can go to a sporting goods store, and they have different types of tents for every possible scenario. I mean, they've got tents if you want to go deep in the woods and hike, they've got tents. If you want a tent with, a picture of Mickey Mouse on the side for you and your little kids to camp in the backyard, they've got that. They even have extreme weather tents. If you feel led to go camping at the North Pole or the Sahara Desert, you can do that. There's all kinds of tents for you to use. I was looking this week, I saw one that I wanted to share with you. This is a picture of what's called the Orange Concept Solar Tent. You can tell immediately, this is kind of a different deal than what most of us think about. It's a solar-powered tent made up of this special fabric that during the day when the sun is out, it stores up energy so that at night you can go in there and you have enough energy left over from the day to heat this built-in heating system inside the tent. Not only that, it has a built-in lighting system, it has a Wi-Fi console, and a specifically designed charging station where you can plug in your iPad, your laptop, your flat screen computer, anything you want to charge, you can charge it. The manufacturers say that it's perfect for people who like to camp at music festivals or what they call urban campers. Now, it also costs a whole lot of money. So if you're looking for this, I can give you the information because they're going to give me some commission. But here's the deal. As comfortable as that looks, compared to other tents, you can go in there, you got heat, you got lights, you can charge your stuff. As comfortable as that looks, it's still not quite as comfortable as being at home. You know what I mean? It's one thing to be in a cool tent. It's something else to sit in your chair, watch your TV, take a shower in your shower, lay down and rest in your bed. That can be comfortable, but it's not quite as comfortable. And the reason it's not as comfortable is because a tent is not meant to be permanent. You're not supposed to live in a tent. And if you find yourself at some point in your life living in a tent, it means something's gone wrong. It can be comfortable, but it's not permanent. It's meant to be a temporary experience. That's why Paul uses it as an example of life on earth. By definition, life on earth is a temporary condition. It was never meant to be permanent. Because of that, there's some things that go with life on earth that aren't necessarily pleasant. Verse 2, Paul says, "Meanwhile, while we're here, we groan, longing to be clothed instead with our heavenly dwellings." Paul says, hey, you go through life on earth, there will be some things that cause you to groan. Sometimes it'll be physical problems or changes that you never saw coming. So you get up in the morning, you look in the mirror, and you notice a wrinkle that was not there the day before, and you groan. Or maybe the hair on your head stops growing, and it starts growing other places, and you're not sure how to deal with that, and you start to groan. How many of you ever had this experience? You sit in a chair for too long, and you go to get up and you groan as you get out of the chair. Raise your hand. You all are more honest than the first service. I'll just say this. How many of you would never admit that under any conditions, that you had to groan getting up out of a chair? There's just stuff that happens. Your back gets tight, your legs start to weaken, and it just starts to get a little bit difficult to do things that used to be easy. But it's not just physical things. It's the emotional pain and the hurts and the habits that you pick up over lifetime. So you go through life and people disappoint you and your family falls apart and your finances fall apart and you lose your job and you get a bad diagnosis and all you can do is let out a groan. And in the back of your mind, you got this recurring thought that it wasn't supposed to be like this. And just in case you missed it, Paul even says it again in verse 4. He says, "For while we're in this tent, we groan and we're burdened." Pretty good description of what life on earth sometimes feels like. It's not all bad, but there are some things that happen. All you can do is sit back and you think, there has to be something better than this. There has to be something better than what I'm experiencing. And the answer is that there is. There was a different world that you were created for. Ecclesiastes 3, Solomon says that God has written eternity into the hearts of every person. What that means is deep within every person we have this built-in desire for a world that's better than the world that we currently find ourselves in. That's why you get to verse 5. Paul says, if you're a follower of Jesus, if you've been adopted into his family, then you have the Holy Spirit living inside you as a down payment or a deposit on this world to come. That means if you're a follower of Jesus, you've got a lot to look forward to. But then when you get to verse 6, he talks about some very specific things that happen when the life of a believer comes to an end. Check this out, 2 Corinthians 5, verse 6. Therefore, we are always confident and know that as long as we are at home in the body, we are away from the Lord. For we live by faith, not by sight. We are confident, I say, and would prefer to be away from the body and at home with the Lord. Now, a lot of things we don't know, but here's 3 things that are clear from Scripture. Number 1, when your earthly life comes to an end, there will be a moment of separation. There will be a moment when your heart stops beating, your lungs capture your last breath. There'll be this moment when your soul, the part of you that makes you you, will separate from your body, will separate from this earthly tent, and at that point your body becomes an empty shell. It's like a tent that's been left behind, and your soul enters into eternity. Matthew 10, Jesus said it like this. He said, do not be afraid of those who can kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. Rather be afraid of the one who can destroy both soul and body in hell. Now, notice he's making this distinction between your body and your soul. Your body's temporary. Your soul's going to live forever. Now, it's true, no matter how much you work out, no matter how many vitamins you take, no matter how much you watch your diet, eventually your body's going to die. It can happen a million different ways, but the result is always the same. You might live to be 105, you might live to be 25, but the result will be the same. Eventually, every single one of us comes to the finish line. And the scary part is you don't know where the finish line is at. Nobody can tell you that. So you just keep inching closer and closer. But the point is, some point in the future, all of us come to this moment where our soul separates from our body. Your body's going to die, but your soul's going to exist forever. And then after that moment of separation, the Bible talks about this second thing that happens, this moment of recognition. Your soul separates from your body, and then you have this moment of recognition. Over in Luke 16, Jesus tells a story about 2 guys who both die on the same day. And yet they wind up in dramatically different places. One of the guys that Jesus talks about is known simply as the rich man. His name's never given, but we know he's a rich guy. He lives in a mansion. He's got servants. He snaps his fingers and people show up. He's living on Easy Street. The other guy is a guy named Lazarus. Not the same Lazarus that Jesus raised from the dead in John 11, but this Lazarus is a beggar. And the way the story goes, Lazarus sits at the front gate of the rich man's house every day, and he begs for the leftover food, and the rich man, for whatever reason, ignores him. Then the day comes that both the rich man and Lazarus both pass away. And that's where the story gets really interesting, because instead of stopping the story there, Jesus continues on. And with his words, he paints us a picture of what comes next. Check this out. The time came when the beggar died and the angels carried him to Abraham's side. The rich man also died and was buried. In Hades, where he was in torment, he looked up and he saw Abraham far away with Lazarus by his side. Now check out this next part. So he called to him, Father Abraham, have pity on me and send Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, because I am in agony in this fire. Now from there, it gets even more intense as they have this conversation with Father Abraham about their life on earth. But the point is, here are these 2 guys on earth, man, they were only physically separated by just a few feet. But in eternity, they were light years apart. And I'll be honest, there's parts of that story I don't really know how to explain, but here's a couple things I know for sure. 1 minute after you die, you'll know exactly where you're going to spend eternity. Won't be any uncertainty. Won't be any second guessing. Won't be any confusion. You'll take your last breath on earth and immediately you'll know where you're going to spend eternity. The Bible teaches that you'll be fully conscious of everything that's happening to you and around you. And the second thing I know for sure is that once you die, you'll immediately be in one of two possible locations. The first location is what the Bible describes as a prison. It's a prison. A lot of things we don't know about it, but it's always pictured as a place of punishment. It's a place of isolation and loneliness. And worst of all, if you read what Jesus said in Luke 16, it's a place of endless regret. It's one of those places where you're going to be there and on constant repeat in your mind are going to be all those moments when you had the opportunity to turn towards Christ and instead you kept going your own way. Place of endless regret. 1 Peter 3, Peter says this about Jesus after the resurrection, after the crucifixion. He says, after being alive, he went and he made proclamation to the imprisoned spirits, to those who were disobedient long ago. Now, different people look at this different ways, but the way I understand it is that once you die, if you're not a follower of Jesus, your soul is immediately taken into custody where you await the final judgment. You might think about it like a suspected criminal who the judge orders into custody and they go to prison to await their trial. Now, they haven't been through the final verdict yet. They haven't experienced the final judgment, but you know that your fate is sealed. If you look it up online, there's a lot of debate about what's the worst prison in the world. But one of the strong contenders is a prison down in Venezuela known as the Sabaneta Prison. And even though it was built to house just 700 people, it now houses over 4,000 of Venezuela's worst criminals. It's gotten so bad over the years that the government of Venezuela couldn't find anybody to work there, so they started picking out random prisoners, and they started arming the prisoners just to try to keep some level of control over what goes on there. Hugo Chavez, the controversial former president of Venezuela, described it as the gateway to the fifth circle of hell. And so you get the picture. If you look it up online, I mean, that's not a place that anybody in their right mind would want to go. And yet, what the Bible makes clear is that for those who die outside of Christ, you immediately will find yourself in a prison that's so horrible that we don't even have the words to describe it. It's so horrible, there's not even words. And the worst part of it all is that there's no hope of escaping. And there's no release date on the calendar. Now, the good news is that the prison is not the only option. The other option is a place that Jesus calls paradise. A couple weeks ago, we looked at the story of the thief on the cross. Jesus is hanging there between these two thieves. One of the thieves spends all day hurling insults at Jesus. The other guy comes to this moment where he puts his trust in Christ and he makes this very simple request of Jesus. He says, Jesus, when this is over, when you go to your kingdom, can I go with you? And do you remember what happened? Luke 23, Jesus turns to him and says this. He says, today you will be with me in paradise. In other words, Jesus is saying, hey, just a few minutes, we're going to die, we're going to take our last breath, we're going to leave this earthly tent behind, and you're going to find yourself in a place called paradise with me. Same thing that Paul says in verse 8 of 2 Corinthians 5, when he says, we're confident, and I would prefer to be away from the body and at home with the Lord. The key word there is home. Paul said, hey, if you're a follower of Jesus, then the moment you take your last breath on earth, your soul leaves behind the earthly tent that is your body, and you immediately find yourself at home with the Lord. The way I understand it, this paradise that Jesus talks about and that Paul references is a place where believers go to spend time with Jesus while they await the final judgment and the new heaven and the new earth that John talks about in Revelation 21. The word that Jesus uses for paradise is a word that means a garden or a grove of some sort. It's a picture of comfort and contentment. So rather than the frustration that we deal with in this life, we go to a place that's defined by joy and unbroken intimacy. It's the place that all of us were created for. It's the place that we're secretly longing for. It's a place that's much better than this place. If you're a believer, that's where you go. One more thing Paul mentions here. And after you die, you have this moment of separation, you have this moment of recognition, and then you'll have the opportunity to experience a personal conversation. Check out the way Paul says this in verse 9. So we make it our goal to please him, whether we're at home in the body or away from it. For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, so that each of us may receive what is due us for the things done while in the body, whether good or bad. Now, the way I understand it, there are two distinct judgments the New Testament describes. One we know as the great white throne judgment, or the judgment day. We'll talk about that in a couple weeks. But what Paul's talking about here is something different. This is a judgment that's reserved for followers of Jesus, in which you have the opportunity to sit down with Jesus and talk about your life. Now, if you're like me, that thought of that makes you a little bit uncomfortable. Maybe a whole lot uncomfortable. Imagine what it would be like to sit down and talk with your mother or your grandmother about everything you ever did. And then multiply that times 1,000,000, and that's pretty close to what it'll feel like to talk. I mean, you imagine sitting down and talking to Jesus when you know he's seen everything you've ever done. He knows every thought that you've ever had. Now, there's a part of us that's not looking forward to that conversation. But there's something important here that you can miss if you're not careful. The phrase that Paul uses for the judgment seat of Christ there in verse 10 is a Greek word that was used to describe the platform where the runners in the Olympic Games would go and stand just before they were given their award. So you win the race, you've seen this, you win the race, you stand on this platform, they give you a gold medal. You get second, you get a silver. Third and bronze, and at the very least you get something for completing the race. You get to celebrate the fact that you finished the race. Now here's something that you may want to write down somewhere. When it comes to your salvation, when it comes to where you're going to spend eternity, you're saved completely by grace. Make sure you understand it. I mean, if it depended on you, if it had anything at all to do with you, you'd have no chance. You'd have no hope of making it. When it comes to your salvation, you're saved by grace, but you'll be rewarded for your works. That means that what you do matters. And what you do to help advance the kingdom of God on earth especially matters. Because when it's all said and done, that's what counts. That's why in verse 9, Paul says this. He says, hey, in light of everything we know about what's coming next, you should have a new goal for your life. And the goal is this. You should live to please Christ. That's your goal. Paul says we make it our goal to please him. So when you make it your goal to live your life in a way that pleases Christ instead of living to please yourself, you live differently. All of a sudden, instead of making decisions based on what you want, you hit the pause button, you look in the mirror, and you ask yourself, what is it that God wants? I mean, when you're living only for the moment and it's about you, you think differently than you do when you're living for eternity, and you begin living with the end in mind, and you begin asking yourself every day, what is it that I can do now that's going to please Christ? Totally different way to live. A few days ago, I was reading on a website. It's a website that's meant to teach you to become a better writer. And there was one particular article that popped up that was focused on how to create the perfect ending for your story. It was written by two well-known authors, a lot of published books between them. And at the beginning of the article, they both admit that when it comes to writing a story, figuring out the ending is the hardest part. The first line of the article was so good, I thought I'd share it with you. Here's what it said. It said, the hardest part of writing a story might just be figuring out how to end a story. Pro tip, don't blow the ending. Pretty good advice. So I thought more about that. I thought, the same thing that applies to writing a story also applies to writing your story. Because here's what I know is true. No matter how many billions of dollars they invest, no matter how many people join this ultra secret club and invest all their money and all their energy in eliminating death, there is an end that's coming for all of us. And my hope is that it's way off in the future. But I don't know. None of us are guaranteed even another hour. And if that's true, that means the only way to avoid blowing the ending is to start preparing now. I mean, if you know that one day in the future the story of your life is going to come to an end, then the only logical thing would be to begin preparing for it now. But here's what you have to understand. When you come to the last chapter of your life on earth, that's not the last chapter. That's just the next chapter. In fact, that's just the introduction to an eternity that's going to be spent somewhere either in God's presence or apart from God's presence. The last chapter of your life on earth is never the last chapter. It's simply a transition point from this life to what comes next. With that in mind, I want to share something written by C.S. Lewis, the great writer. Here's what he said. He said, Christianity asserts that every individual human being is going to live forever. And this must be either true or false. Now check this out. Now there are a good many things which would not be worth bothering about if I were going to live only 70 years, but which I had better bother about very seriously if I'm going to live forever. Some things, if this life is all there is, there's some things you don't need to worry too much about. But if there's more, there's some things you need to worry a whole lot about. Some of you here this morning, if I don't miss my guess, you're here, maybe watching online. If the end were suddenly to come, you're not sure what your next chapter would look like. If the end were suddenly to come, and I hope it doesn't, but if it did, you have to ask yourself, would you find yourself in paradise with Jesus, or would you wake up in a prison so horrible that it defies description? Now, I know there's some of you get offended when you hear a question like that, and you think, oh, the preacher's trying to scare us, isn't that awful, and et cetera, et cetera. That's not my intention. But I want you to know, just because something's scary doesn't mean it's not true. You go through life, there's a lot of things that are scary that are true. And if that question makes you a little uncomfortable, if that question offends you a little bit, good. Because maybe you need to be a little uncomfortable. So if you're here and you're not sure what this next chapter for you looks like, I want you to think very seriously about preparing for it now. I want you to stand. We're going to sing just a brief invitation together. If you want to talk to somebody, you want to pray with somebody, David and I will be here. All you have to do is just come down here and just hang out on these front rows, and we'll talk to you. You don't have to say anything. We won't embarrass you. If you're not comfortable, coming in front of a bunch of people, hey, we'll be here after church. You just come talk to us. We'll stay as long as it takes. But for all of us here, you have to ask yourself, there's a word that Paul uses 2 or 3 times in this passage that I hope you picked up on. It's the word confidence. It says we're confident in this. And maybe you're here and you don't have that confidence, so maybe it's a good time to hit the pause button and ask yourself, what comes next? I know what this chapter looks like, but what's the next chapter look like? And whatever you do, don't blow the ending. Let's sing.